Tiffin Talks, I have with me the wonderful Wajahat Habibullah, one of our most civil servants. And I emphasize both civil and service because he truly is one of our most civilized civil servants. And he's written a wonderful and remarkable book, My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy, which encapsulate a golden period, I think, in our history and tell us really what went on behind the scenes in several really momentous occasions. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Habibullah.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I'd like to begin right away by talking to you about Rajiv, as such a charismatic figure and yet so tragic, as you say, because someone who couldn't quite fulfill the potential he had for his country and for himself. And I just want to quote one remarkable line that you've written when you hear that he's shot. You say, slowly, every light on my horizon, my every hope for the future, my own, but that not just my own, but that of my India, blanked out. And I think that really emphasizes to a lot of us who were growing up during that period who and what Rajiv Gandhi was. So, you knew him quite well and you worked so closely with him. So talk us through that period.
Well, it was a time of great hope. Uh, it was a time when maybe unrealistically we were all young people. Uh, he was a young prime minister, the youngest that we'd had, even though his mother had been a young person when she became prime minister, but he was even younger. And we all, working with him, had this, were inspired
Hmm.
by his vision for India. In fact, why I mentioned that the lights blinked out not only for me, but for the India, for my India, is because we had dreamt together of a kind of India into which we had hoped
Hmm.
our country would evolve. Because India was at that time an infant nation, and as a nation having become free only in 1947. Of course, I mean, the whole question of its nationhood is much wider.
Hmm.
But as a geographic entity and as a nation of its own, it had been born only in 1947, and it was experimenting all the time. It had become a world leader in many respects, and certainly as a consequence of many things that initiated in Rajiv's time, it leapfrogged from being a very backward, tradition-bound society, despite the ministrations of, Pandit Nehru, who was such a modern mind, modern thinker. But despite all that, at the rural and at the grassroots level, it still remained highly tradition bound. Then it became, in the time of Rajiv, things were initiated, which actually carried it into among the forefront of the world's nations, technologically and otherwise, in so many respects. And this has, of course, led to so many contradictions in our society. And India has been described as a land of contradictions. It is a land of religion, it is also a land of no religion. The concept of shunya. And as I've mentioned, I have been a devotee of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the concept of shunya is something that is typical of India. It's not that only India enjoys that capacity. That there is this is shunya is a world concept, but India has been conscious of it. Our philosophers have talked of it, and it informs all the religious traditions of our country, even those which have come from what is today abroad, because in those days there was no India when it actually came. But all these came from across the world and were confluenced in India. And here there was therefore a dream. And I mentioned the fact that although Rajiv was very much a product of, like all of us, of modern India and a modern world, he also was grounded and deeply rooted in the traditions of the Bhagavad Gita. thanks, I think, largely to his mother.
um, there was also a remarkable energy and a remarkable new force within the government and the people that he gathered around him. They of course, there was all this talk about the Babalo government, but they were also, some of them, extremely fine professionals, and some, like yourself and Mani Shankar Iyer, who really did add so much value to the PMO. Talk a little about the people around him at that point and the Amar Akbar Antony trio that you mentioned.
The interesting point is, and earlier when I was discussing this matter with some people, somebody else had talked about Baba Log and the fact that the country was run along the traditions of the Baba Log, and I explained that it was not quite that. Yes, the Baba Log around him, if you call them that, certainly helped process the information that flowed in. But the remarkable thing about Rajiv was how open he was to ideas and to new ideas, and how he always encouraged new ideas. This is what brought him into touch with the leading minds of his time, including the most remarkable of all, I would suggest, was Sam Petroda. But I have mentioned various cases where simply on a tour he had met with a person who gave him a new idea, like, for example, Bijon Mishra. And from that, then he said, no, this is a very good idea. And then he would build on it. And therefore, the job of the Baba Log really was to get these ideas from him and then build on these ideas. And then on that basis, policies would be formulated. Now, as I mentioned in the book also, sometimes this question, this search for ideas and trying to encourage ideas also was not easily understood, particularly because his mother's style of functioning was quite different. She, of course, encouraged ideas, but she would normally listen to these quietly and then give her conclusions. And her conclusions were considered the decision. Nobody argued with those. But Rajiv always wanted to open an argument. So when he spoke, he was wanting to provoke you into a discussion. And this I learned very early. Of course, I had known him for such a long time, but we never really entered into this kind of relationship before. In the Prime Minister's office, very often when we were on tour, Mani Shankar Iyer, he and I would sit and talk. And what we were talking about in his initial state, and I mentioned that in the book, was his concern about reaching out to the general public. He was always very concerned. He felt that the general public did not have access to the highest levels of government. It's also true. And unfortunately, it's also often true now. But then we would argue about how, and I remember him discussing and Mani supporting this idea that maybe we should have smaller districts. I had argued that no, that will not help. Because if you have smaller districts, and you can understand that is a viable argument. If you have smaller districts, you simply have more expenses because you have more district magistrates. They have to have their fleet of cars. They have to have their offices built up. They have to have all this, and you would have a lot of money being spent on that, and very little going to the actual servicing of the public needs. And that is how he finally came to this conclusion regarding Panchayati Raj. He came to it after accessing a lot of ideas and getting Baba Log like Mani and myself and others to then work on formulating a plan which could then become a program. So I think this is something that I've tried to bring out uh, because he was always, and many people who've known him will tell you this. He's always open to ideas. And therefore, many people also have this impression that he was Hare ki baat sunte the, and the last person who would tell him something, he would agree. It's not the last person was the thing. The last person, yes, may have triggered some thought, but then the idea of the last person would then go through a process. It would not be he was not, that there's been that recent quote by High Commissioner Goodall that a king among courtiers, the former British Commissioner, when reporting back to his Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, called him a king among courtiers. I would not agree. He was no king among courtiers. He was a person, yes, but I can understand how an outsider got that impression. But he was a man who never really tried to browbeat anyone, always open to ideas, and always open to argument. Because even if you said something And he said, no, I think this is the case. And again, coming back to district magic, this concept of the he said, I think we should have smaller districts. I said, I'm very sorry, sir. I don't think so at all. So, I mean, one could have that conversation with him. He didn't say, Mosh, not none of that. So it was a very good working relationship, and I think this relationship was shared by all those who worked with him. I think if you ask any of those, and I mentioned so many of them in my book, who actually worked in the Prime Minister's office with Rajiv Gandhi, will all give you the same impression of how open he was, how he listened to them, even when he didn't always do as they might have said.
In fact, one of the remarkable things is you talk about the elevation of his chair. He was so conscious that and so particular about details that he didn't want his chair to be higher than that of the others in the room. I mean, look at that man, you know. The attention to detail that he had with excuse me, the attention to detail he had with words, with the architecture, with the design of his room, with everything. That was what was so remarkable about him.
I would agree. He went into considerable detail, and very often he would, we were supposed to be the thinkers and the intellectuals feeding into the system, but his questions would often not necessarily, they would nonplus us. We would have to search for the answers. We'd have to look for the answers. The challenges that he faced, of course, I've described in the book in considerable detail, many of which were not solved, many of which have been the source of many of the problems we have over here, or the resolution had been. The duty of it is he always was willing to admit his mistakes, to understand his mistake. This has not, of course, come out very clearly because he had this habit of saying, you see, hum dekhenge. Now, hum dekhenge is really an expression in English. We will see to it. Now, if you mention that we will see to it, then you know the meaning is a little different from hum dekhenge. The insinuation is a little different. In hum dekhenge means we will consider. But what he meant always was that we have to see to it. That's why often in his speeches he would say, "Hum देखेंगे कि ऐसा करेंगे," which means that we will see to it that it is done. But I digressed onto that. His question in always, he was always wanting to consider, always wanting to examine, always wanting to re-examine. And when things did not turn out the way that he had expected, he wanted to know the reasons, so that he could put things right. And the tragedy, apart from, of course, the tragedy of his going himself, but the tragedy is that there were so many things that after his being prime minister, he realized had been wrong. And he would have been the first to try and set them right if he had come back again in
Exactly.
1991. And we had in fact discussed these things. During the time that I was serving in Kashmir, I was in constant touch with him all the time.
Hmm.
Farooq Abdullah was the person who was in touch with him, but I was also very much in touch with him. And we discussed issues, not only to do with Kashmir, but to do with the rest of the country. Luckily, I developed that kind of relationship with him where I could discuss these things with him. And when I went to see him, I discussed these things. And he had a rethinking on a number of subjects. I mentioned those, of course. And the principal trust which he would have committed himself to had he come back in his second term was to bring about universal disarmament. I've explained in that was his principal concern insofar as foreign policy is concerned. But on that, the detailed study which he had done, the very detailed study of how this could be done, and he'd worked out plans for that. That is why in the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, we had felt that there could be no greater tribute to him than to actually celebrate his initiative on universal nuclear disarmament, something that was not to happen then and has not happened.
I wonder what kind of leader he would have been in the second term. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, I think I would have known. He had become politically much more sensitive. You know, in my book, I have criticized him for being politically rather naive. I've even described his political blunders in some detail. This is no great mystery, and I don't think I'm revealing any secrets by saying that. But whereas he was very committed to administrative change, to bring about changes in the functioning of government, he did, he did not really have a clear idea about except in his broad concept of giving political voice to the common folk. And that, of course, he tried to do through Panchayati Raj. And as I mentioned in my book, a corollary to that was the RTI, which, of course, came very much later. And it wasn't there in his time at all, but was a necessity. I can say, as I was Chief Information Commissioner, if we wanted to have responsiveness, transparency, and accountability, which he considered necessary in government. But given that, the fact is that the direction in which he set the country was one that brought it to its modernity here. But on the other hand, the political decisions that he often took uh, did not lead to necessarily salutary uh, conclusions. Being leader of the opposition in parliament had in fact woken him up to that, had in fact been a training ground for the politician. He had become, because you can imagine, he had not been very interested in politics throughout his career, except to the extent that he always wanted to be helpful to his mother because he felt that his mother was alone and a person who was surrounded by people who wanted to take advantage of her, and then she was a widow. So he worked for her, but he did not work for her politically like his brother did. And he was really thrust into a political role only in 1980 with his father when his in 82 when his when his sorry when his brother died, when Sanjay died, and his mother asked him to join. And then he became general secretary. But even as general secretary, you would have noticed that the work that he did was more management, as you know, that farmer Kisan rally, and then managing the
Asian
Asian Games.
Games, yeah.
So it was more management, not really political. Except to the extent that even the management of that Asian Games, he was in constant touch with Mr. Longowal, which later stood him in good stead in reaching the Rajiv Longowal Accord. But in his second term, he had a much better exposition to politics, being in government. And then at that time, and his having served as prime minister, he became much more conversant and become friends with a number of people who were opposition politicians. I have explained to you the high regard that Atalji had for him because he had reached out to Atalji. Now he continued to do that, but that would have been the level of politics had he come back. That is one side, and then of course the day-to-day level of politics as to how the government was to be run, the political basis of the functioning of government. This, I think, would have been different. And this I can say with a certain degree of confidence because we had discussed these issues and we did discuss how things had gone wrong
Right.
in before he demitted office as prime minister.
There's so much talk now about the idea of new India and, how the old India of entitlement and elites and, well, I suppose you could say the Doon School types who used to run the government, how they need to be displaced and and a new elite is emerging, which has risen through hard work and not Harvard and all that conversation. I
You
want to
see,
ask you, his New India was far more positive, wasn't it? It had much more, it had less of this negativity and hatred and divisiveness. It was much more harmonious.
well, it was much more harmonious. But you know, the root of what you're talking of the displacement of entitlement, also lay at that time.
Yeah,
Because, as I've explained, he brought down the voting age. He wanted to have a Doon School in every district, which is the Navodaya Vidyalayas, which he went into him. He said, if I could have that education, why is that education not available to all? Even this young boy, Fayyaz, you know, the Lieutenant Fayyaz, who gave his life for the country in
yes,
Kashmir recently, he was from the Navodaya Vidyalaya. So uh, these were all concepts that he wanted to broaden the scope of the Indian uh, the Indian educated class. And in that he succeeded. So now if there's a demand, well, you see, now we need to bring in these people. They are not on the basis of class and caste and so on, but we need to bring in these people. Yes, it is understandable. But had Rajiv been there, I would have assumed that they would have come in inevitably in consequence of his policies. They would have come in without, as you mentioned, hostility and hatred. Versus "Alo, hum ye lit." No, not that. But you come in, you compete, you get your position, and there is everything. There is such a huge competition for entering. I remember when I joined St. Stephen's College, I had applied and then I didn't get a response. And then my father went to St. Stephen's and said that, you see, my son had applied, he's not received any reply, but he's been taken, that's why. So he didn't. So you see, that was the attitude. But now that is not the case. You can't get anywhere. So that competitive edge has certainly gone up because of the inputs that took place at that time, the participation in governance, the participation in running the industry. All this is widened considerably, and therefore there is now, of course, much more competition. But you're right. Had had he been able to come in for a second or a third term, as we hoped he would, uh, the uh, the history of India, how India developed, would have been different, in my view.
sorry. Talk a little about the Amar Akbar Antony of his PMO. A very interesting combination and different streams of people.
The Amar Akbar Anthony, again, his experimentation. Throughout his time, he kept on wanting, as I said, new ideas, and from that, on that basis, working on that. He therefore thought of this idea of having not a prime minister's a principal secretary, as his mother had had. In fact, the first principal secretary had been appointed, P.L. Haksar, by his mother, and then she had a series of principal secretaries after that, the last of whom was Dr. P.C. Alexander, who is the one who actually recruited me into the prime minister's office. But uh, so he got rid of all that. Then a number of people who were on her personal staff, including Mr. Dhawan and things, he then he then sent them elsewhere, and he started with this idea of having parliamentary secretaries. So the focus of the PMO, apart from an administrative backup, which of course would be used for coordinating with the various ministries, the prime minister's office was to be a more of a political office, and therefore you had these parliamentary secretaries. The main focus was actually working with the elected representatives of the people. Uh, it didn't work out. It didn't work out that way. It couldn't work out in that way. I would say, as having been in that office, it couldn't work out because over the years and over that whole period of Mrs. Gandhi's government, and even before, uh, the uh, the structure that started emerging even in Panditji's time. Panditji's time, the PMO was supposed to be a small, it was not a prime minister's secretary, it was a prime minister's office. It's supposed to be a small office. It had gone on expanding and become a large behemoth by the time of Mr. Gandhi. Now, Rajiv wanted to reverse that, but he couldn't do it because the system had become, it had become a structure. And therefore, then he went back to the idea of having a secretary. Again, not a principal secretary, but first he had a secretary, but by the time he left, he also had a principal secretary. So that is why I have called that his attempt as an aspiration. There were many administrative reforms in his time, but the main focus of his restructuring the secretariat and district structure of the country, that remained only an aspiration. Sorry, I can't. You're muted.
You've been remarkably forthright about two of the most critical things that he did politically. One was, of course, the reversal of the Shah Bano judgment, and the other was the opening of the locks in Babri Masjid. You've been very frank. Uh, where do you think he went wrong in these two critical issues?
In the Shah Bano case, I'm afraid, having thought of it so often, I made the same mistake as my friend MJ Akbar made in advising him. Although our advice was altogether different. He was very keen that there should be an amendment, and I was keen that there should not be an amendment, but not for the right reasons. I said since the Supreme Court had made this decision, the government should in no way interfere. But the point at which both of us were wrong, both Akbar and myself, was that we assumed that because the clergy and had been a massive protest by every clerical organization, virtually in the country from across the country, that we felt that this is the thinking of the Muslim community. Now, neither I nor MJ Akbar, but certainly Arif Muhammad Khan, had access to the pulse of the Muslim community. I, because being an IAS officer and a part of, we've talked of a Doon School elite, uh, of course, I was very much part of the community, but I was not conscious of that. My social upbringing and environment was altogether much wider, not restricted to community. And MJ Akbar had a similar background, a westernized, modern Indian, rather than simply a Muslim. So we misjudged that. There was a large feeling, and this I came to know much later, and particularly when I was chairman of the Minorities Commission. There's a large feeling among the Muslims themselves that this judgment should not be interfered with, that this would be fair to the women, and particularly divorced women. It's another matter that the Shah Bano amendment has in many cases worked very effectively because it succeeded in getting women maintenance when otherwise they would not have got anything. But that was a mistake. Uh, and I do feel that I still feel that the ruling of the Supreme Court, which was a ruling, Justice Chandrachud, if you remember, he had done it after detailed study of the Quran. Now, if he had not, then I might have said, well, you see, this ruling has been made without a proper study, and therefore we may think in terms of an amendment. But that was not the reason. So therefore, that is, and of course, the other person who was deeply involved in this conversation was Arif Muhammad Khan. He will be able to give you inputs on this particular on this particular phase. He is now, of course, governor of Kerala, because he was a person who had opposed amendment, and also opposed the amendment not because he was highly modernistic, but because, in fact, he was relying on more conservative interpretation of the religion.
Right.
So that is something that went wrong. Uh, and of course, the more orthodox elements among Rajiv's own supporters were pressurizing him. But theirs would be, again, which I mentioned earlier, theirs would be reflective of the voice of the clergy because they themselves belonged to that class of society. So that was the case which went wrong there. Now, so far as Babri Masjid is concerned, I have no doubt that the question of opening the locks and things is something that had been considered and discussed. Because after I'd written this, somebody else said that no, they were discussing this in front of me and so on. No doubt the matter was discussed in the party, but he had not taken any such decision to open the locks. And of this I'm convinced for the reasons that I mentioned in my book and because of my conversation with him. Now, the fact is that that happened. But again, a decision taken by him regarding the Shilanyas. Uh, Now, what should have been his approach or not have been his approach at that time is another matter. I have mentioned, of course, that there had Mr. N.D. Tiwari and Mr. Bhuta Singh had been working with the Hindu Mahasabha to bring about some kind of an understanding. And then his being associated, of course, the Shilanyas was not done by him, but his being in some way associated with the Shilanyas because he started his election campaign from there of 1989 from Ayodhya, taking well taking advantage or I mean in the shadow of the Shilanyas, then made it appear that well he is the person who was behind. And I noticed that many people in the party I think still say well he was the person who actually initiated the whole process. So no, he didn't initiate the process, but there again, because of that, he was associated with the process, and I'm convinced that that lost him the election of 1980.
But that's, you think that's what lost it?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's I think, and I want to mention why I think so, because where did he lose the election?
Yeah.
He lost badly in UP
Okay.
and Bihar.
Right.
And those were the areas which would have been most affected by the opening of the locks. Uh, in the other states, where the idea of issues like Bofas would have been more open to discussion, like Kerala, people with the most educated people in the country, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, there he won hands down.
So, but I mean, like all politicians, he was a complex man. I mean, nothing, no person can be without flaws. He obviously had them.
Oh well, like any politician, I don't know, like any person,
Yes.
politics itself, and Indian politics itself is very complex. It's not as dreadful as Pakistan's politics. Because I've also dabbled in Pakistan's politics so far as the book is concerned, but it is dreadful enough as it is. So and he was a person who was a political innocent. So to start with, but the point is that certainly he would have had as an individual he would have had flaws. Uh, he also had his flaws are widely recognized, so I really don't need to harp on them. But his merits are not usually acknowledged. Sincerity, his honesty, not only honesty in terms of money and things like that, but his honesty, intellectual. These are things that you do not come by very easily in individuals, not only in politics, across society. People who wish to make it big in their society. Very often, these are the talents which are compromised. He never compromised, even though people say what they have to say. But I can vouch for that, having known him as well as I did. I mean, there were people who knew him much better. I can't claim to have been a close friend, but as well as I did. Uh, feel, and one of the purposes of my writing this book was to show, even if people disagree with me, was to also show that these people like me could see the merits in the man. And that is why I've quoted Brutus
Yes.
from uh, from Julius Caesar.
Julius Caesar. What? What has the reaction to the book been? I wonder.
Well, you are the one who can tell me better what the reaction has been. So far, I've only received uh, kind words regarding the book. Uh, certain mistakes have also been pointed out. Like, for example, I mentioned that General Timaya was the third commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, third Indian commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, whereas actually he was the fourth. I mentioned somewhere that was really a clerical error that Mani Shankar Iyer was in the cabinet of P.V. Narasimha Rao, whereas he was not. So these few errors are there, but and they have been pointed out. My friends have been good enough to point these out. But as I mentioned to you, I got this call from a general who felt that my presentation on the brass tacks was not entirely accurate. But those are the facts as I saw them, and as I mentioned to you, my sources. So I hope that the book will provide a subject for discussion. As Amartya Sen has mentioned, that a good work is not one that answers questions. A good work is one that raises questions. So I hope that my book will succeed in doing that.
How has the family reacted to it?
Well, the family has been reading it, and my wife has been gone through half the book, and she said that there are things in this that I wasn't even aware of. You can imagine. And my grandsons are now reading the book, and for them, it's been a bit of a revelation because they were not there at that time at all. And I hope I've gone up in their eyes, but I can't say yet. I'll have to wait and see once they finish reading.
Let's talk about Kashmir because that's such an integral part of your life as well as the book. Uh,
And of yours?
yes, of course. So many lost opportunities, aren't there? Especially especially the relationship that could have been between Rajiv and Farooq and the prospects of it.
Yes. Well, the lost opportunities, yes. But Kashmir is also an issue on which I have written separately, as you know, uh, and in which I have served, and therefore has uh, taken a lot out of me. So far as Kashmir is concerned, I regard my own efforts in Kashmir as a failure. Why? Because from the time that I began serving there, this is not to do with Raji, but from the time that I began serving there, back in 1969, very soon I realized that if we are to resolve the issue of Kashmir, the legal framework and the political structure and all these have their place. But we are not going to be able to resolve it unless we can make the Kashmiris, all Kashmiris, mind, which includes the Kashmiri Muslims who are a majority, Shia and Sunni, the Kashmiri Pandits, who at one time had been a dominating community in that state, had lost that group because the Kashmiri Sikhs were a very large section, indigenous section of Kashmiri, and a very few Kashmiri Muslims, unless they, as Kashmiris, and not as Hindu Muslim Sikhs, as Kashmiris, can come to think of India as their own country. The blight of Kashmir, in my view, has been this feeling among Kashmiris that India is India and that we are Kashmiris and we are separate. And this ran across the board. It has nothing to do with only any particular community. Uh, it's also understandable because this is a distinct cultural heritage, a unique cultural heritage, and a very rich cultural heritage. It's not it was just some sort of hanger on. It was a very distinct cultural heritage. It survived centuries, and therefore this feeling that now what happened was that that's what I've tried to describe in my book. This stupidity of the Pakistani army by trying to resolve the issue by military means. I can't think of anything more stupid, but as I discovered in my research for this book, it was the invasion of Kashmir was really done by because Jinnah had targeted the northwest frontier, feeling that he will not get the support of the tribesmen. He had got the tribesmen involved in a jihad in Kashmir so that he could strengthen his hold on the northwest frontier, which he was afraid of losing because Afghanistan was claiming that. But anyway, that's another story. Here you come to Kashmir. The Kashmiris had therefore felt that they have joined India for a particular purpose, and that was to enjoy freedom. And Sheikh Abdullah was quite clear on that, if you want to enjoy freedom, you're going to get it nowhere else but in India. Now, starting with 1953 and so on, but even in Sheikh Abdullah's own time, the kind of freedom that we and the rest of India were enjoying, the Kashmiris did not enjoy. And therefore, they had this feeling that they were separate. My argument had been that the Kashmiris must feel that they're part of the Indian, but the Indians must feel that the Kashmiris are Indians. And therefore, we should not talk about them. Unfortunately, we still talk about them as though they're something, a separate entity. They are Indians, and I wanted that feeling to be there, that they're Indians like you and I. Of course, you are a Kashmiri, so you have the right to say that I don't feel an Indian, but as you and I are Indians, that was my life's mission. Became increasingly my life's mission when the insurgency broke, because I saw the answer to the insurgency only in this, that the people, if they start feeling Indian, then what is the insurgency? What are they rebelling against? Administrative structures, political structures can come and go, they can change, they can be adjusted in the way that people want. But basically, they must feel that they're among their own brothers and sisters, and they can ask for and do whatever they want, as long as it's part of a larger family. I mean, you have that kind of thing even within families, that one brother wants to have a little better than the other brother, or he sees one brother is taking away too much. That's all that it needed to be. In that, I failed. Uh, so I've blamed myself, and I've gone public and written about it also. So therefore, I would not fault Rajiv for that. That failure is mine. But Rajiv's failure was that he, well, his success was that he tried to bring about a rapprochement, because the relationship between, as you mentioned, Farooq and Mrs. Gandhi had broken badly. And I have mentioned
Yes.
in my book, of course, his last meeting with Mrs. Gandhi when she was actually Prime Minister, and after Operation Blue Star when she visited
So
Ladakh.
frosty. Such a frosty meeting.
Yes. And this is the first time actually he's talked to me so openly about. Oh, I knew the meeting. I was there. I knew that they were meeting. I knew that he came out and he went, and all he said to me at that point was, "Thank you so much for letting me have this meeting." But that was all. I didn't know what happened in that meeting. Farooq only told me now when I asked him about what actually happened in that meeting. But then, thanks to Rajiv, even before he became prime minister, he tried to build a rapprochement between the two of them, because Mrs. Gandhi was furious over something that she'd been fed, which in fact was not true. If she'd even asked me that, I would have probably told her it was not true. She never did, because she was relying on her political contacts to tell her that. Now, that that being the case, the when Rajiv came back, he felt that a rapprochement with Farooq is the way out. Uh, then what went wrong? I think it's been written about extensively. But what the rapprochement with Farooq and Rajiv should have been, and Farooq has spoken about it. He said that he had worked out an ambitious development program, and this is, I think it sends a message to succeeding governments. Every now and then you hear of a package being announced for Kashmir. So many crores, so many crores. Does the situation get any better? No, it has not got better. Why? Because it's not packages that I wanted. The answer lies in that same old question, in which I had failed to resolve. Do the people of Kashmir feel Indian? And that question could not be answered in Rajiv's time. It cannot be answered even today.
is a tragedy. But Rajiv himself felt very Kashmiri, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
And therefore, when I was going back to Kashmir in 1990 to take over as Special Commissioner Anantnag when Mr. Jagmohan was governor, and that was the VP Singh government, then I'd got a call on him. And he specifically told me about the Kashmiri Pandits. He said the backbone of India in Kashmir was the Kashmiri Pandit. But they have all been completely alienated. Then, of course, he came there later. I've discussed that his visit to Kashmir later. And I've discussed the issue of the Kashmiri Pandits, how it was totally mismanaged. Uh, Mr. Jagmohan was wanting to help the Kashmiri Pandits. But in offering that help through a government which had collapsed altogether, but I've part of that government and I've vouched for the fact that the government has collapsed. I was in Anantnag, and the exodus from Srinagar took place before it took place from Anantnag. Srinagar, which was the state headquarters, that started taking place in January. In Anantnag, it started taking place only at the end of February. And uh, my advice was often ignored by Mr. Jagmohan. Then I left the state because my father had fallen very ill and his last days, so I went and spent the last. And then I came back again. George Fernandez tried repeatedly to come back and uh, and reconcile the Pandits, but unfortunately he ran into loggerheads with Mufti Saeed, who was at that time Home Minister, and said, "Who is he? Who is he to come and interfere in the issues of J&K?" So that politics then fouled up any effort that he might have wanted to make. So all that was caused this completely dreadful situation which exists this day. But you will be happy to know that there are, and they don't like this publicized because it makes them a little vulnerable. There are only about 300 families, 3,000 families of Kashmiris now Kashmiri Pandits now in Kashmir, but they're there and they are fully part of that Kashmiri society.
Yes.
So hopefully all is not lost. But yes, in answer to your question, this was one of the great tragedies which Rajiv apprehended because he did feel that, and correctly so, that without the Kashmiri Pandits, the Kashmiri culture
Hmm.
would lose its character. Because the character, even though the Pandits may not be Kashmiri Muslims, but the character of the Kashmiri was incomplete without the Pandit. Who was the teacher? Who was the Hakim? Who was the Patwari?
I wonder what Rajiv would have felt about Article 370 being abrogated.
No, this matter came up in his time also.
Okay.
Arun Nehru was of the idea that it should be abrogated. And this was argued in his time. But you see, the point was, and maybe Rajiv would have in the long term felt that Article 370 should be also changed, abrogated, or not abrogated, but amended and changed. You know that the Article 370 itself says it's a temporary article. Temporary in the sense that not that it once India consolidates its position, that then it goes, but to lead on to further democratic liberties, which was the aspiration of the Kashmiri Pandits when they actually opted to be part of India. But let us keep that aside. He may have also agreed at a later stage, but he felt that the problem now is not the Article 370 or the lack of the Article 370. In fact, the JKLF, in declaring kind of insurgency that it did in 1989 against the government of India, against the government of J and the government of India, talked about the facade of Article 370. Talked about the fact that Article 370 was no good. It did not protect the Kashmiris. So removing the Article 370 would not have in any way consolidated our position. It would have further weakened the position. That this is only a facade, which also is only a fig leaf, which also the government of India has removed. That would have been the reaction. And this is clearly understood by Rajiv. So his feeling was Thus, let us bring the situation into an equitable sort of relationship. And he saw Kashmir, because it abuts into Central Asia, as a kind of showcase of India, where international tourism, international investment would be developed, so that people would come, visit, see the place, and bring wealth to the Kashmiris, and it could therefore become a rich place, a rich and wealthy place with a lot of happy and cheerful citizens and beautiful citizens, of course, also. And that was his vision for the future of Kashmir. So for that, Article 370's removal or maintenance, it would be simply, uh, mudding the waters before he actually came to the situation where he could afford to move forward with his overall game plan.
Was Bofors really the lowest point in his administration, his waffling on it, his, not being able to actually say clearly that this did not involve him?
Politically, yes, not administratively, because Bofors, as I've explained in my work also, is one of the best artillery equipments in the Indian Army. And in fact, in his time, and I've of course been quite critical of General Sundarji, but General Sundarji was a master of the idea of armaments. He was very au fait, he well knew all the various developments that are taking place across the world in military hardware, and he was very good at assessing what kind of military hardware would be suitable to India. And Bofors was one of that. Of course, what went wrong there was the idea. You see, now Arun Nehru had been dropped from the cabinet. There were many people who were out gunning for Rajiv. So Bofors became a good instrument. There was also another submarine affair. That time the submarine affair went nowhere. It became submarine. It didn't become an issue. But this issue became, and yes, partly because of Rajiv's political mishandling. For example, I've given an example which says that there's no middlemen. Now, these middlemen were there. Middlemen are always appointed by these commercial enterprises to promote their case to the other side. It's not that you're promoted, you are appointing middlemen to make money for yourself. I mean, anybody who knows this knows that. But he was unable to argue that properly because he went ahead and said that no, there are no middlemen. Well, in fact, there were middlemen. So this, then of course, there's a Polish court who you see he's telling lies. He's not Mr. Clean. He's made so much
And then,
money.
and
Then
then Ram Jethmalani and his questions would just go
question,
on
and
and
then Quattrochi, Italian, and therefore Italian. And so I am not aware of any social relations between Mrs. Sonia Gandhi and Quattrochi. It's quite possible there were some. But even if there were some, it never went beyond that. Uh, I never came across. I mean, when I went when I met the family, I think I never came across Mr. Quattrochi anywhere, not even a mention of him that you see, "Usse Raja Bakja ke baat kijiye," I would say nothing of the kind. So, if there was an acquaintance, that's quite possible. But it sort of made out that they were all in sync about making money out of it. This is, in my view, totally ridiculous. But it was bought. It was then promoted, and the political opponents of Rajiv had seen the chink in the armor and saw the possibility of ousting him from power on this basis and succeeded in doing so. Then, of course, because as you know, even after being ousted from power, Rajiv's party was still the largest party in parliament, but he made no effort, and this was deliberate. He made no effort to try and increase his numbers, as his successor governments have done famously after him. He did not make that effort. He preferred that the country should go for elections again and choose its new own government rather than simply adjusting these seats there and those seats there and somehow or the other getting to sit on the throne.
ask one last question.
Please.
I always felt that the two Aruns had let him down at the
Uh,
badly.
Arun Nehru, yes, and I've explained how in some detail. Arun Singh, I mentioned in my book also. Uh, I know Arun Singh's younger brother, Martin Singh,
Hmm.
was one of my closest friends. And Arun, of course, is also a friend. His parents were very good friends of my parents. So I have an old family relationship with Arun. But he never spoke to me. And I mentioned in the book that he did not. Initially, he had agreed to speak to me about this. But then when I went to say, I said, now, may I come over and speak? He said, no, I think I'm not going to speak about it. Did he let him down? I do know. And this is the call that I got from this general today. Sundarji was keeping Arun fully informed. Arun knew all the details of Operation Brass Tack. But I also knew that Rajiv was furious because he did not have the full details of Operation Brass Tacks. He felt he was being kept in the dark, which is why he got so angry with Mr. Venkataraman. He said, what do these people think? They can go on doing all these things without even informing me. Also, that has got nothing to do with Operation Brass Tacks. That's something to do with what he had gone and said in Pakistan about a possible visit by the Prime Minister. So, but this is what had made him furious, and I know that he was furious, uh, and I know, and this is not only known to me. There were people in the office. I mentioned, of course, in the book also how Gopi Arora had delayed sending a particular note to Arun Singh because he said that the relationship between the two become very fragile. So that happened. Now, why was it? Did Rajiv feel let down by Arun? Arun had not been keeping him in confidence. I'm afraid I wouldn't hazard a guess in that because I really don't know. I know neither Rajiv's view on that. He never told me that Arun has let me down, and nor have I got Arun's view. So I do know that he was uh, angry about on the question of brass tacks with Arun, but he never told me actually the reason why. So I'm afraid I can't answer that.
But really, I think for anyone who really wants to relive that era and also understand where we are today, what went wrong, what went right, I would highly recommend My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy by Wajahat Habibullah. Thank you so much, Wajahat Habibullah, for being with us and for talking us through this remarkable book. I recommend it to everyone who has an interest in contemporary history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kavi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pavan.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Vajahat. If I can,
Yes, yes.
I
If
can,
you
I can.
can, you must.
No, no,
Now,
I'm,
now,
I'm I'm a student of history myself, Vajahat.
you
I have
are
studied
good, good.
history, though I was more inclined towards the medieval Indian history and Mughal
Well,
history.
that
But
was that was my main period, medieval Indian history,
Right.
oh,
and
lovely.
I'd wanted very much to write of it. And if, in fact, if I'd continued teaching history in St. Stephen's, I would have, in fact, researched that period and written of it. But in fact, in my scoring in my MA, the highest scores that I got were in European history, and
Oh, lovely.
that was largely because my teacher was Parthasarthi Gupta, who I mentioned, of
Okay.
course, in my book
Right.
also,
Yes, yes.
and a greater a greater master of European history in India I have not seen. And I'm
Hmm.
afraid he's not been given the kind of credit which he deserves because his way of lecturing was rather idiosyncratic. He didn't lecture in a very cohesive. You have to be able to follow him to be able to understand what he was saying. So an ordinary student would say, "Oh gosh, no, I can't understand it." If you tried to do that, he was very great. But tell me now, how is it working, Pavan? Does this will you be showing this Tiffin Talks on Facebook or what?
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely, sir. So this link, what I'll do, I'll forward this link to Kaveree ma'am, the Facebook link, and you
And
can
I'll
forward that
send
to your friends as
yeah,
well. Also, this will go live on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning as well,
Oh,
which you
good.
I'll
can
send you
propagate
the
through
link.
your own circles.
Yeah.
Absolutely, ma'am will send you all the links, and we have Insta page also. We have a Facebook page also where we put all our shows live, uh,
Good,
So
and
good.
we
we've
put
got
And
some
may I
tremendous
ask
response.
Kaveri a question? Why
yes.
are you called Kaveri?
Because my grandfather was a freedom fighter from Kashmir, and he thought that there's nothing better than uniting India, Kashmir to Kaveri.
Kashmir to Kaveri.
Yes,
So it is the tower, the geographical entity of
yes,
Kaveri from out to which you are named.
yes.
Good.
Thank you so
Lovely.
much.
Thank you
Thank
so much, guys. Thank you so much.
you.
Okay.
Thank you for this lovely session, and keep watching Tiffin Talks. Cheers. Bye
I
bye.
would. I would.
Yes.
Bye. Man, he sounds very much like somebody we know. No, we don't know him. Is Pavan somebody?